Well, good morning, everyone. Yes, it's true I'm from Australia, and you may hear a funny accent every now and then. This picture is just a mile from here, west. You've probably been on this campus for a day and a half, and we may not have taken you there, so I apologize for that. This is the beach in front of my office, actually. Maybe that explains why I moved from Australia. And that pier has been there since 1916. It's called the Scripps pier. It's a pier that we use to do experiments and test out, these days, test out the robots that I'm going to talk to you about. So I'm sure you understand that our oceans are under pressure at the moment. For thousands of years, there were just a few human beings on the planet, and the ocean was sort of able to absorb whatever we did to it. Then a few hundred years ago, we started putting our sewage into the ocean, and again, the ocean was so big and we were so tiny that not much happened. But now that we have 6.5 billion people on the planet, and about half of them live within a few miles of the coast, lots of things we're doing to the planet Earth, or I like to call it the planet ocean, since it's 71% covered by water. Lots of things we're doing to it seem to be causing it problems. And it's a vast place out there, and it's an expensive place to do experiments because you have to send people out there, and people need boats, and they need pretty big boats if they're going to be out in all kinds of weather. And so for quite a few decades now, scientists have understood what it is we ought to be measuring about the ocean and indeed the atmosphere, but it's just been too darn expensive. And no taxpayer would pay the sort of money that we need to take ships out there or take thousands of ships out there. But fortunately, you and I are just living through the beginning of a new age in understanding the ocean, and that's an age where the invention of cell phones and satellite communications and tiny little robots and fantastic batteries mean that we can now send all kinds of robots out into the ocean. And my job today is to tell you just a little bit about that and then give you a chance to answer some questions. So just a little bit about Scripps Institution of Oceanography. We're 107 years old. We've been down on the beach near here for most of that time. We started in Del Coronado, for those of you who know where that is, just a few miles south. This is actually a photo of what it looked like a long time ago. There was actually nothing in La Jolla when Miss Ellen Scripps bought 180 acres of land and gave it to the institution. And one of our greatest creations was 49 years ago. My very famous predecessor, Roger Revelle, helped found the University of California, San Diego. And what you see around you is really something that Roger envisioned and ultimately invented. So there are about, as I said, there are about 1,400 people that I pay. We run an aquarium that has 500 or 600 volunteers who help me run it, and so I don't pay them, but I'm very grateful to them. And we study everything to do with the solid Earth, seismology, earthquakes, everything to do with the atmosphere, climate, and oceans. So here's the problem I'm addressing, summarized in one page. We want to go out and measure lots of properties of the ocean, just simple things like the temperature and the salinity, how much salt there is in the water, but even more complicated things. Is the ocean becoming more acidic? What's living in the ocean? What bacteria and microbes are living in the ocean, and at what depth? Are they the same at night as they are in the daytime? So we sort of need a continuous observing presence in the ocean. The same thing in the atmosphere. We'd like to have more measurements in the atmosphere. Some things we can measure from space, some things we can measure from satellites, but most of what we can see about the ocean from space stops at the surface of the ocean. Of course, there's often 5 or 7 miles more ocean underneath that surface that we need to look at. So I'm going to talk to you about what we can do with robots. Probably the first thing you should know about Scripps is that one of my colleagues, Charles David Keeling, was the first person to measure CO2 in the atmosphere. He started doing that in 1958, and we've been doing it every month since. Dave passed away in 2005, but we've continued to do that. And by looking at the isotopic ratios of carbon in that increased carbon dioxide, we've been able to prove that this carbon dioxide comes from human emissions, basically from burning fossil fuel. And I think most of you have heard the story about the properties of CO2 in the atmosphere. It traps heat. So this was not some kind of government commission. No, there was no committee. This was just an individual scientist who said, you know, we ought to check out whether burning of fossil fuels is leaving a permanent imprint on the atmosphere. So much of what I'll tell you about is due to the genius of individual men and women who had just had a good idea about doing an experiment, worked very, very hard to raise the money to do the experiment, because as you see here, Dave's lab on Mauna Loa in Hawaii, that's obviously not a cheap activity. The other thing that Dave did in his lifetime, which is sort of another monumental experiment, is that he started measuring the pH of the ocean. So when you put CO2 in the atmosphere, and let me just pause there and say, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere at the moment is about 390 parts per million, whatever that is. We can talk about that unit of measurement. But before the Industrial Revolution, it was about 280. So it's gone up 39% since human beings started to burn fossil fuel. And the effect we understand that has on the planet is like putting blankets on your bed during winter. Now, you know, in California, we probably don't know much about this, but imagine you lived in northern Maine during the winter and you had 3 blankets on your bed, and then someone put a 4th blanket on your bed. That's what we've been doing to planet Earth, and that's what CO2 does. CO2 doesn't generate heat, but it traps heat that we generate as a community. And so it's just like having, you know, an extra blanket on your bed. And if you were nice and comfortable with 3 blankets, then probably with 4 blankets you're going to get way too hot and get a fever. So that 39% CO2 is in the atmosphere, and Dave worried about the fact that some of that would dissolve in the ocean. So he started measuring the pH, which you probably know is minus the logarithm to the base 10 of the concentration of hydrogen ions in the ocean. And that's affected by how much CO2 dissolves in the ocean. So that thanks to Dave's measurements, which started 22 years ago, we know that the CO2 in the ocean has increased 30% since 1850. Now, why is it 39% in the atmosphere and 30% in the ocean? It's just that there's a lag. There's actually a tiny little interface between all of the atmosphere and all of the ocean, and it takes quite a few decades for the ocean to catch up and let all of that CO2 equilibrate from the atmosphere into the ocean. And so you may start to see in the newspapers and certainly in the scientific journals a lot of scientists worrying about the effect of this increased CO2 and therefore the decrease in the pH of the ocean and how that might affect the planet. So here at Scripps we have a bunch of scientists, and this is Vicky and Andrew, and they study what happens to little organisms in the ocean that make calcium carbonate shells. Vicky does. These are little things called pteropods. They're little snails, tiny little snails that a lot of things in the ocean eat, like baby salmon eat these pteropods. But in order to grow, these pteropods have to excrete calcium carbonate, and if the water becomes too acidic, basically their shells dissolve. And Vicky's been doing experiments in the ocean and in the lab to study that. But that's obviously something that you have to do out in the ocean. And one of the challenges that your generation will have will be to monitor the pH of the ocean as we burn more fossil fuels and make sure we don't take it to a dangerous location. So let's just go back 5 or 10 years and figure out how would we go out into the ocean and actually measure the acidity of the ocean. Well, there was only one way to do it. You can't do it from space. You can't do it from land. You have to take ships out into the ocean. And this is the fleet of vessels that I manage here out of San Diego. These are 4 vessels on the outside here, two very large vessels, Ravel and Melville, almost 300 feet long, and 2 smaller vessels. And these are sort of standard oceanographic research vessels. These days they're kind of floating computers. If we went down to Point Loma and went on to one of my vessels, I think the only one in port at the moment is the Sproul. You would be surprised. You know, there are some labs there and there are some scientific equipment, but they're packed full of every kind of computer you can imagine. And that's because on these big computers these big vessels, we're doing seismology and we're looking at the topography of the Earth and the great tectonic plates of the Earth, and we're studying the biology. And all those things require, and we're studying the biology by sound. We're bouncing, sound off schools of fish and all kinds of things. And that requires enormous amounts of computing power. So while these look like, ships, they're actually, just think of them as gigantic floating computers. But you probably figure out running a ship like that is expensive. And to run one of these big ships costs me $35,000 a day. And I feel very lucky that we've been able to raise the money to keep these 4 vessels going. But obviously 4 ships, and even with all my colleagues around the country, there's probably another 12 ships that different universities and research agencies own. Even that is just a drop in the bucket in terms of how many data points we'd like to collect to monitor what's going on in the ocean. So that's yesterday. Let me tell you what your future is. And we've actually done just one example of what the future is going to look like. And that's these robots. This project is called Argo. It started here in Scripps and has now got the support of 26 countries. And each one of those black dots is the location of a little robot in the ocean on 9th of April 2010. So on that day there were 3,255 of them that had reported in. And what these robots do is measure the temperature and the salt content of the ocean as a function of where they are, but they're able to sink themselves into the ocean. They're actually able to sink themselves a mile into the ocean. So they're like a little submarine. They actually can change their density like a submarine does, so they actually disappear into the ocean, and then we take them down about a mile in the ocean, we let them drift around for 10 days, and then they're programmed to come up to the surface. And I'll show you how that works. They're about the same height as a human being. They have a little bladder down the bottom here, which changes the density that causes them to go up and down. At the top here, they have a radio antenna that beams the data back to the lab here. And this data is freely available to everybody. If you go to our website, you can download all the data from all the robots. And then there's various instruments at the top here that measure those quantities that I said, the temperature and the salinity. And there's various location devices and so on. So let me see if I can play a little movie here. They're pretty easy to deploy. We actually make some of them down. We have a wonderful machine shop down right next to the beach, a bunch of very talented machinists. The bodies are made out of aluminium and titanium. And they cost about $15,000 each, and they last about 5 years. So we actually drop them off the side of ships. They don't have to be research vessels. Sometimes we drop them up the side of tourist vessels or Navy vessels if there's a part of the ocean that we have never been able to get to and we know someone who's going there. Normally they'll slow down for a few minutes and let us drop this off. So this robot, if we kept playing the movie, would ride itself and then go into operation. So let me show you this animation of how this works. This is a little vessel that comes along. It's going to throw off one of these robots. They have batteries in them, but only to collect scientific data. They don't have any power. And so they're at the mercy of the currents. And so this whole experiment was designed to cover the entire planet, the entire oceans, with enough robots that we would have coverage on a grid about 3 degrees by 3 degrees, if you know what that is. Here's a little example of the oil that's in this bladder that changes the density and causes it to change location in the water column. We can actually program how deep they go in the open ocean. We program them to go down a mile, as I said. I'm sure you know about this horrible disaster that's happened in the Gulf of Mexico recently. We have the next generation of these in the Gulf, and the Gulf is not so deep, so we only send them down half a mile into the ocean. Here it is bubbling up to the surface. It's been taking data all the time, and now it's going to beam its data back through the satellite network. So this has just been, this has been about 30 years of work. And so let's just pause for a second and think, if you're an engineer or a scientist 30 years ago, and you had the idea, you realized that you could never get enough ships out there to measure the heat content of the ocean. By the way, one of the experiments this work is used for is to check the hypothesis of global warming, because if the atmosphere is warming, then that heat has to leak into the ocean. So in the 60s, this was a very profound and important experiment to see if the oceans were heating up, and it turned out they were. But just imagine if you're trying to design this experiment. The guy who did this, Russ Davis, he somehow understood that someone else would make the batteries. He could have spent his entire life, developing little batteries. When he did the first one of these 30 years ago, it lasted a couple of weeks. And obviously that's not a very good experiment. They now last 5 years. But he somehow understood the way that personal radios were going, and then telephones and so on. And he figured that eventually he'd just be able to buy batteries. And so these robots are just packed full of regular lithium batteries that you would see in a cell phone or camera or something. The other thing he understood is that someone else would develop the satellite network, because obviously if you have a robot thousands of miles out in the ocean, you can't go out there and get the data, because that would be just as expensive as doing the experiment. But he understood that someone else would invent satellite communications, and that after they'd had the satellites up there for a while, they would let him use that to bring the data back to the lab. So he spent all his energy developing a very low energy way of moving these robots up and down in the water column, and of course developing instruments that didn't last just a week, measuring devices, temperature thermometers and things to measure salinity. He wanted really robust instruments that would last 5 or 6 years. And so after many decades, all of those technologies came together and allow us to do this amazing experiment. So if you type Argo into Google, you'll just see hundreds and hundreds of scientific papers that have used this data in very different ways to understand everything about our oceans. And as I mentioned, there were actually 26 countries. Here's another picture of where those robots are. Of course, they drift around. But these are actually color-coded by the different countries that paid for the robot. So one of the most important results is that different groups have used the data in different ways to analyze the heat content of the ocean, starting in 1955, meshing it with data that was taken from experiments, and now using this Argo data more recently to test the hypothesis of whether the world's ocean is warming up. So what's next? Well, the next generation of these are things we call gliders. And these are also unpowered in the sense that they don't have a propeller, but they actually move forward in a way that I'll explain to you. They glide in the water just like a hang glider glides in the atmosphere. And even though a hang glider doesn't have a propeller, hang gliders obviously move forward and around and can turn. And it's the same principle here. So in this case, this is called a spray glider that Professor Davis developed, is sort of next generation. We've been using these for about a year off the coast of California to go out 400 or 500 miles, and then we can actually reprogram these guys and bring them back to the coast and go pick them up in our inflatable boat. So we've been using these gliders in the Gulf of Mexico to actually try and understand if there's oil deep in the water, or what this mess of oil and surfactant and water is doing. So this is Louisiana up here. Here's New Orleans. This is where the Deepwater Horizon is, the rig that blew up and has been spewing oil into the Gulf for 85 days. And these are the tracks of some of our gliders where we've been cruising around robotically with this thing that's just about 6 feet long, trying to understand this mess of oil and water. So let me try and explain to you how this works. It's a bit unfortunate that we have that lettering over it. But what happens is that we change the density of the glider and it moves forward and it starts to dive. And say in the Gulf of Mexico it might go down half a mile. And because it has the fins on it, it actually moves forward, just like a hang glider. And when it gets to a pre-programmed depth, we actually, how do we cause it to go forward? The instruments inside are on little rails, and we use some of the battery power to move those instruments a little bit further forward towards the nose. So literally the whole experiment, all the equipment that's going to measure the very different kinds of scientific and engineering data we're collecting, they actually move slightly forward, and they change the center of mass, and the thing moves forward. When we get to the pre-programmed depth, we actually move the instruments back, again using a tiny amount of battery power. And then it starts to surface, of course, because it's more buoyant than the water that it is. But because it has the fins on it, it surfaces by moving forward again. So that if you follow the trajectory of this thing over 10 hours, it's gone 5 kilometers or 3 hours. And while it's been in the water, we can program it to collect data. Now, on these robots, we've put many more different kinds of instruments on them. So we have various fluorometers on them. That's how we hope to detect the difference between oil and water in the Gulf. We can put biological instruments on them. We have a whole group of engineers who are miniaturizing instruments at the moment. And so different experiments, different times we put this kind of robot in the water, we can collect different data. When it gets to the surface, we tell it to roll 90 degrees. So we do that by rolling the instruments around inside. It seems like a pretty rocky way, but it works. And then the flipper comes out, and it's actually the antenna. And it communicates with the Iridium telephone network. And so in a few seconds, we suck all the data out of the robot back to the lab here. The advantage of this kind of technology is that we can reprogram the robot. So particularly in the Gulf, when we started out, we didn't know exactly where the oil was going to go. So we can actually send it a new program and say, head in that direction. And so then it'll roll back. We'll move the instruments forward. It'll start its next dive, and it'll head off in the right direction. So, you know, for the engineers in the audience, here's a few specifications of this. I have to tell you, this is just going to change our entire understanding of the way the ocean works. Because they're so cheap, they've turned out to be so reliable, and we can pack them full of just any kind of instrument that you want to take out in the ocean. So you could measure light scattering, you can detect how much photosynthesis is going on in the water. We can put little sonar detectors on them so we can listen for fish. There's all kinds of things. By the way, you can probably imagine there's military applications of these kind of things too, if you're out there listening for bad guys. You know, we're just getting started on this. I think it's going to be your generation that actually figures out how we interrogate the planet with this. Let me show you an example of what we've done in California. Here we are down here in San Diego. The yellow is the land. Here's Monterey. San Francisco is up here. LA is in here. So we've been sending these gliders out every couple of months, just along these transects here. We call these lines transects. And we've been measuring data with ships along those lines for the last 60 years. And so we know what the fish population is and how many fish larvae there are and what the temperature is and what the salinity is. And so we can look back at time and see how the ocean off California has changed. Sometimes the fish disappear. We're able to understand what the physical conditions are, El Nino or La Nina or whatever the ocean currents are doing in trying to understand that. So I think we're just at the beginning of you know, the technology here, and I think the best analogy I can make is if you remember medical doctors when you were very young, really all they had was a stethoscope. You know, remember if you got sick, they'd go to the doctor and they'd put this thing on your chest and they'd listen. I don't know what the heck they were listening for, but that's sort of all they had. And now we have all these things like MRIs and CAT scans. And if you think about it from a data point of view, instead of having, you know, a data point every couple of seconds from a stethoscope, modern medicine gets terabytes of data that, you know, can figure out if there's something wrong with your brain or your internal organs. Well, what's happening in oceanography over the next 10 years is going to be just like that. We're going to go from a stethoscope to having, you know, MRIs of the ocean and be able to process that data. So let me give you a glimpse into where the future is going, and gives me a chance to tell you about Kyle Grindley, who's just the most amazing engineer. Kyle made a version of this first robot that actually powers itself. So you see this version's a little bit bigger and it's a little bit clunky. But this actually uses the thermal gradient in the ocean to make its own power. So every time this robot does a dive and uses its batteries to energy to make measurements, scientific measurements, and then when it gets to the surface, it beams it back to the satellite network. That also costs energy. Every time this does a dive, these materials on the outside here actually expand and contract thermally, and they generate energy, and they recharge the batteries. And so this is a prototype, but this is where it's been. This is the big island of Hawaii. These are the Hawaiian Islands. So this is not just something we've made up. This is a real, just one robot at this stage. That, as long as nothing breaks, it can go indefinitely, measuring properties of the ocean, because it's not a perpetual motion machine, because it is actually sucking a tiny little bit of energy out of the ocean, because the water at the top of the ocean is warmer than the water at the bottom of the ocean. It uses that temperature difference in order to expand and contract materials, and therefore it can turn that mechanical change into energy. Again, as you understand more about the natural world and physics and chemistry and engineering and math, you can think of lots of ways actually to make power out of the thermal difference in the ocean. And so I certainly look forward to the day when we have a bunch of robots that are packed full of instruments that never need to be serviced, never need to be visited, and never need to have their batteries replaced. So I hope I've given you a glimpse into what's waiting for us in terms of, I like to say, interrogating the planet, learning about the planet. I think the more we learn about it, I must say, the more humble we get. A few decades ago, scientists and engineers were very confident that we understood how the currents of the ocean worked and, how that impacts weather and so on. The more data we collect, the more we understand that the natural world is a very wonderful and mysterious place, and that we humans, need to have a bit of humility when we think about controlling the planet or indeed exploiting its resources. So I think I'll stop there, and I'll be very happy to try to answer your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for a very fascinating talk. So now we have quite a lot of time for questions. So, anyone? Okay.
For the research ship called Flip, I
Yes.
noticed that it was vertical, and it seems like it sinks itself, and the floor changes from horizontal to vertical. So could you explain that?
Sure. This platform, we call it Flip, is a very unusual vessel. There's only one that I know about. It can operate in two orientations. Normally it's flat. It's about 330 feet long, and it doesn't have any power, so we have to have another boat that tows it along. And this is the sort of the bow when it's lying down. When we use this when we want to sort of make our own island. So if we want to do a complicated acoustic experiment in the ocean where we might be bouncing sound around the whole planet, we might be sending sound out of this location and waiting to see how many weeks it takes to go around the entire planet, and we do that quite often. We can tow this platform out to the middle of the ocean and then flood the other end. The other end is like a submarine. It has ballast tanks like a submarine. And then this whole thing turns 90 degrees and sits in the water, just like that. If you go to our website, there's actually a little movie of watching it flip, and I could probably find it on my computer if I had a minute. And it is kind of fun inside during the flipping because the coffee pot is on a rotation thing, and the coffee pot actually rotates 90 degrees so it doesn't spill. Most people actually go look at the toilets because they rotate too. The way that it works, you can see there's various levels here, and so there's places to sleep. When it's lying down and when it's standing up. There are bunks that sort of work both ways. And there's a kitchen and so on, and it all somehow works. It's kind of amazing to look around it. I wish I had a chance to take you all down there and show it. It's when it's not out in the ocean, it's down here in Point Loma, just at San Diego Harbor. And so there's actually a guy in France who would like to build the next version of this. He envisions a whole lot of these flips sort of permanently in the vertical direction that people would live on. They might have, like Flip, they might have 3 decks above water. But he actually envisages a sort of permanent island that might have 8 more decks underwater. And you could go, you might be a scuba diver and you might live under pressure, 8 decks down to do a complicated experiment. The trouble of that is that, it's obviously a very expensive vessel. So he'll have to find a couple of philanthropists, a few billionaires who will help him who build that next generation of Flip.
What method do you use to track the robots in the ocean? GPS?
When they come to the surface, they beam back their location, basically with GPS. With the gliders, we use a very high precision differential GPS to figure out where they are. The gliders have no navigation system. They sort of use what a mariner would call dead reckoning. But and actually, when my colleagues started these, we weren't sure how accurate they would be. But it turns out, unless they go through some very unusual currents, we very rarely have to correct their course. The only time we reprogram them is when we're in the Gulf, when we didn't really know what we were doing to start off with, because right after the accident, no one knew exactly how much oil was coming out. We probably still don't know, and we certainly didn't know where it's going. And so the guidance, the positioning and the navigation turned out to be one of the simpler parts of the program. I'll tell you what the most surprising thing is. We've picked up quite a few of these gliders with huge shark teeth marks in the front of them. So I don't know whether it's the shape or the color. But boy, they seem to make some sharks out there in California really, really mad. And we've just seen these huge bite marks, like a gigantic shark has come in and bit the nose. But one of the amazing things about Russ Davis's design here is that it's incredibly resilient. So, when a huge shark comes and bites the nose of it, it completely stops it, no matter where it is in the water column. But just because of the laws of physics, because it's maybe it's going down, so it's more dense than the water. Even though the shark might have brought it to a dead stop, or it might have rotated it, it has an attitude in the water because of the way we've placed the instruments. It'll eventually, get the right. It'll be flat and it'll be heading down, and it'll pick up speed again. They go at about half a mile an hour. That's their speed, to sort of the natural speed. It has to do with the friction and the mass and those kind of things.
You know how at the beginning you showed us the CO2 emissions graph?
Yeah.
Why is it that it goes up and down?
Great question. Yeah. So each one of those is the annual cycle. So the up and down comes from the northern hemisphere, and it comes from leaves being grown on trees during the summer and then decaying during the winter. So most of the land mass in the Earth is in the northern hemisphere. It's like 40% land in the northern hemisphere and 60% ocean, but in the southern hemisphere it's only 20% land. So almost all this effect comes from the northern hemisphere. And so this is just the sort of almost the annual breathing of the Earth. So if you sort of want to know what the natural fluctuation of CO2 in the atmosphere is, it's this little bit. And actually that hasn't changed for the 52 years that we've been measuring it. It's sort of this baseline of what the total concentration is. So the up and down just comes from summer and winter. Great question.
The prototype robot that you had shown, the one that used,
Makes its own energy, yeah.
You'd shown in the image it was moving along, but I don't see any sort of horizontal propulsion.
It's just drifting with the currents away. And so the first set of robots, the 3,200, they do the same thing. They they were designed actually to travel along with whatever the ocean currents out there. But they spend very little time on the surface, just enough time to transmit their data back. Most of the time where they're traveling is deep ocean currents, which again is something we don't know much about and is quite hard to measure even from a ship. So so that trajectory is a combination of each one of its dives and then sitting for a few days at a mile down, and then it's just the natural ocean currents because the Earth's spinning and rotating, and because there's heat being transferred around the ocean. There are currents in the ocean as well as waves on the surface of the ocean. So that's why this data is so fantastic. I showed you just one graph of the temperature because that was a sort of a monumental experiment and was a great decision point in understanding what CO2 was doing to the planet. But equally, other people have just not looked at the temperature data, just looked at where these robots get taken by currents. And if you take all 3,000 of them, you can actually map out what the ocean currents are doing and whether they do different things in the summer or the winter. And indeed, we're getting enough data so now that we think there are these big ocean cycles, the so-called thermohaline circulation, where we can map out over many years how those ocean currents might evolve. So this particular version of the robot has no power, and it's just taken wherever the ocean wants to take it.
Do you worry about ships colliding with the robots?
Yeah. Do we worry with the ships colliding with the robots? Yeah, we do. And over the years, my colleagues have tried to design them to be a little bit resilient. First of all, we keep them at the surface the absolute minimum time. I'll tell you a funny story. I used to help deploy these robots in Australia when I ran a little version of Scripps in Australia. And one day, one of my scientists came to me and she said that one of our robots was reporting its location from the land near Brisbane in Australia. In fact, if you've heard of that guy Steve Irwin, who was on TV a while back and then got killed by a stingray, I think, it was right next to his crocodile park. This kind of cheesy a tourist attraction that he used to run. And so this scientist said that she was actually going on vacation and she was going to see her family that lived right in that region, and was it okay for her to go and check out why this robot was reporting from 20 miles inland. So she went up there and she drove up to this guy's house, and he had this robot on a saw, a machine saw, and he was just about to cut the ends off it to make it into a mailbox for himself. And he was a fisherman, completely innocently, and he'd accidentally picked up this robot in his net while he was out fishing the previous week. And he liked the shape of it, it's a beautiful color and so on. He thought, man, that'd make a great mailbox. So my scientist called me and said, do you authorize me to spend a few $100s to buy this guy a nice mailbox, and he'll give us back our robot? So he did that. So and so it's a good question of where they end up. You may notice here around Indonesia, this is a very, if we had more time, I would say this is a very important part of the ocean called the Indian Ocean Throughflow, and it's the only part in the ocean apart from Antarctica where the oceans are connected. So actually, the Pacific Ocean rushes through these tiny little openings between the islands of like East Timor and the north of Australia. And so there's actually a gigantic current of water that goes through there. Well, you see, none of the robots are there because anybody that gets anywhere near this gets sucked through really quickly. So we have to design other experiments to measure what's going on in the Indonesian throughflow because none of these robots, hang around long enough to do any good. The other place that they're not any good is in the Gulf of Mexico, again, because of this loop current that you might have heard of in TV, and also the degree of shipping and the number of, there's thousands of oil rigs and other things out in the Gulf. So we don't even bother to deploy them there. And the other place they don't work, of course, is when they get to the ice. To get the data out of them, they actually have to surface, and we have to have a clear shot to the satellite. If they get too far south, and a couple of them have done this, they come up under the frozen sea in wintertime, and then they're no good to us unless they get released again. So, this covers about 97% of the world's ocean, but there's always, a few little areas that you have to think of other ways to get the data.
Okay, one more question.
You said that the gliders, that the equipment inside it is on rails and that it moves. Is it done manually or automatic, and how does it move?
They're on rails, and they're done robotically by a computer program that we can reprogram through the telephone network, through the Iridium satellite network. And so they're just pre-programmed to cause it to dive and come back up again. And so we can control the pitch and roll, like in a plane or an atmospheric glider. And it's kind of fun there. It's like being on a roller coaster, except it's programmed by a computer. And so left to its own devices, it'll just do this every 5 days. It'll just go up and down. And you get a beautiful map of the ocean currents and we have sound instruments that measure the velocity profile of the water going by. We measure the temperature and the salinity, obviously. And so if you just want to be boring about it, you can just drop it off the coast of California and it'll go out 500 miles. And then we program it to just turn around, and it has like a turning radius. It'll go up and down a few times and then it just comes back. What we're learning in the Gulf of Mexico is that we can actually be more interventionist, and so instead of sticking just with the program that we put in the lab before we dropped it off, after we've learned a few days worth of data, we might go back and check out the same area once again. So honestly, we're just getting started with this stuff. I think there's just it's up to people like you who have imagination and figure out how we're going to use these things. Some of my guys are making versions of these that are much smaller. Little tiny robots where we might have, instead of 3,000, we might have, 10,000 little robots. Here's a sort of our imagination. I think none of us know exactly what size robot, and whether it's the glider ones or the dumb ones that just drift around with the current. Honestly, we're just getting started in this, and all ideas are valid and welcome.
Okay, so we are perfectly on time. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.